everyone. You're listening to Horizontes, Latin America's leadership forum. Our focus is on developing business leadership in Latin America, i.e. the skills and topics that leaders need to succeed. I'm John Price, your host. Horizontes is brought to you by America's Market Intelligence, the leading market intelligence company for Latin America. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Matthew Griffin, who may have the coolest job title ever invented. He is a futurist. Matthew has built a successful career out of making predictions 30 to 50 years into the future for government clients like the US and UAE, for private sector clients in banking, electronics, insurance, and entertainment, as well as industry associations. Remarkably, Matthew is still a young guy, and as you will see, brimming with energy. Not the typical profile you might expect of a sage voice hired to look into the future. What makes his work unique are the methodologies he applies to long-term forecasting. Things like wargaming, chaos theory, competitive dynamics, investment and supplier ecosystem monitoring. For those of us working in Latin America, where volatility often prevents us from daring to predict the future, the methods of a futurist offer some hope that long-term planning can be used in our companies and governments, despite the odds. Matt, great to see you. How have you been?
So I've been doing really well, John. So huge amounts of traveling. So I was in New Orleans the other day, and then I was in Munich, which I think is roughly sort of nearby where you are now. And then, back to Florida this week, and then over to Indonesia next week. So
my goodness,
I'm doing very well. I say that now. So, however, over the next couple of weeks, I might very well need a chiropractor. So if you know any, just send it my way.
Well, as my English mother would say, no peace for the wicked, right?
I think I was very wicked in a past life. So maybe that's my lesson now. That's it. When we all get reincarnated by artificial intelligence in the future, that's it. Maybe that's the maybe I should just live a Buddhist-like life.
Well, it's funny you say that, because that's exactly the thinking I portrayed in a letter to my mother this morning when I told her of my recent travel. Matt, I'm very excited to have this chat. You and I met, I guess, gosh, it seems like ages ago, but it was probably only 6 weeks ago in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
And, I'd heard of the title of a futurist. I'd never seen one on display. And it was really interesting to see how you managed your predictions and also how the audience reacted. So I'm looking forward to sharing your insights with our audience today. And I think it'd be useful for everybody to start by asking you, what on earth is a futurist, and what purpose does a futurist serve?
Yes. Well, if anyone knows, but then just feel free to tell me. No, so in all seriousness, a futurist is somebody basically who looks at lots and lots of different data points, basically, and then tries to establish what the future could look like. So in futurist terms, this is where we typically talk in terms of probable futures, preferable futures, preposterous futures, and so on and so forth. But inevitably, basically, what we've really tried to do is we try to help people see what could happen in the future, or even will happen. And I get onto dangerous ground, basically, when I say when we can see what will happen, because a lot of futurists say that you can't possibly predict the future. And yet at the same time, there will also be the same people that say in the future, computer power basically will grow, network speeds will increase, all cars will drive themselves and be electric, powered by lithium-ion batteries and everything else. So, but essentially what we sort of try to do is actually help organizations around the world, as well as governments, understand what the future could look like or will look like for a variety of different reasons, and then actually help them develop the visions and strategies to build that future, develop that future, or in some cases, depending on the companies and the motivations, lead that future.
Fair enough. And how far typically into the future do you sort of endeavor to make your predictions?
So people can shoot me down now. That's it. But I'll shoot myself down first. So I typically try to look up to 50 years out. There's a couple of reasons for that. Now, on the one hand, basically, I deal with the future, which I regard as the next 20 years. So that's where the vast majority of multinationals like to sit, in that sort of, what will happen or could happen in the next 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 years. But when you're working with sort of G7 and G20 governments, typically they want to understand what the longer term futures look like. So, for example, the future of education, jobs and skills, technology, healthcare, welfare state, tax, transportation, energy, and so on and so forth. But increasingly what I see when we talk to multinationals is the Chinese multinationals, organizations like Tencent, Alibaba, Huawei, very much want to see what that 50 years looks like, along with companies like Samsung, for example. But in the West, organizations typically want to sort of stay closer to the current day with typically sort of 5 to 10 years, anything beyond that, and it starts stretching. But when we start trying to envisage the deep future, as I call it, inevitably, I often say, this is where things get fuzzy. The further out that we go, so the further out that we try to predict or see what will happen or could happen, the fuzzier it gets. But also the broader your vision of view, the fuzzier it gets as well. So for example, when we have a look at the development of artificial intelligence, we know that AIs will get increasingly powerful, and that's artificial narrow intelligence. But we've already got liquid artificial intelligences and even AIs that are made out of DNA in the labs. So when we're looking towards the year 2040, 2050, we could start seeing liquid artificial intelligences that were developed by companies or universities like Harvard starting to become not necessarily mainstream, because, when we have a look at the future, there are three things that we really try to understand. What could the future look like? So that really comes down to what problems are we trying to solve? How will that future come about? And that is, how can we combine different technologies together to create the products of the future? But then the big thing that everyone really wants to know is, when will this future actually arrive? And when we talk about when the future will arrive, typically, if we see an advanced technology today, it will take about 10 to 20 years for that to become more mainstream, depending on what the technology is. We can see that with sort of virtual reality, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, which really is a 60-year-old technology in itself. But when we have a look at when will these things arrive, that's a combination of affordability, accessibility of those products and services, the ease of use, the utility of those products and services. Are they regulated? Do the insurers insure them against, misuse or whatever it happens to be? So it's that when that is really one of the hardest things to predict. It's kind of that Betamax versus VHS video conversation. Right. You've got two great technologies, but when will Betamax become ubiquitous? But because of lobbying and marketing, actually it was the VHS video cassette basically that became ubiquitous and commercialized instead. So there's lots and lots of different things basically that can happen to trip up the when things arrive, or even if they're going to be arriving. Because when I was in Louisiana, for example, we sort of looked at the future of transportation as it related to 2055 basically for the state. And when you actually have a look at the history of US transportation, in the 1960s, the companies that were buying the tram networks in San Francisco and other places around the US were actually the oil companies and the car companies, who then ripped up all the tram lines. Because if you've got no trams in a city, you need to buy cars that then need petrol or diesel. So yeah, hence we sort of talk in terms of fuzzy futures the further out that we get. But it's very complex to do, and there are millions of moving data points and parts.
Sure.
As futurists, we try to sort of plot the path between them all and then say, there's a good chance that this is the one that's going to come to fruition. That's where you put your chips if you're in Vegas.
Right. I was struck by something you said. I mean, I understand, I think it's well accepted that the Eastern mentality tends to be longer term, whether you're talking to governments or private sector.
Yeah.
So it doesn't surprise me that Japanese and Korean firms and possibly a few Chinese firms think that way.
Yeah.
But I was struck by what you said about governments hiring you for a 50-year outlook, particularly Western democracies, which are sort of often disparaged for the fact that they think in such short term. They're thinking about the next electoral cycle.
Exactly.
So I find it rather gratifying to know that at least somebody in government is thinking longer term. Tell me who would it be in, say, a Western democracy, whether it's a European or Canadian or American government, who is looking at 50 years, and how do they realistically apply those predictions into whether it's policy making or regulatory building blocks and things like that?
So it really varies, but typically, basically, it's senior level, I say decision makers or members. So, for example, when we actually have a look at the US, it's typically kind of governors or senators, but then also, I say, heads of department. For example, basically, we will have head of department for transportation or whatever it happens to be. So, head of transportation and planning, that kind of stuff. You're absolutely right. When we have a look at democracies, the vast majority of politicians are much more concerned about that kind of populist vote and try to translate that into their campaign strategy. So, for example, if everybody actually cares about the cost of living or energy bills, then as a politician, the central pillar of my campaign is going to be, over the next year, I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure that you aren't hit by the cost of living increases. Now, on the one hand, basically that can translate into things like subsidies, for example. It can translate into taxing the local energy utilities, basically, and then giving some of that back to the consumers on the front foot. However, what it doesn't necessarily translate into is into that longer term view of, well, over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to invest more in renewable energy, because as we see oil and gas prices continue to roller coaster, go up and down like a roller coaster, we're seeing renewable energy generation costs almost hitting zero. And in fact, actually in Europe, we now have energy utilities that are paying people to take energy from them because we're generating so much energy from wind farms. So with politicians, the vast majority of politicians kind of take that sort of 5-year view. That's it. But because they realize basically that if they aren't in sync with what their voters want or what their voters expect them to deliver, then they just aren't going to get voted in the first place. Which then means basically that from a futures perspective, depending on the depending on the flags basically that you're actually working with and talking to, some people care about the 5-year future, whereas others basically care about the 50-year future, because there are other people that say, look, while we've got this massive cost of living increase, we can try to solve it in the short term. But actually, when you have a look at Germany, where you and I have been recently, the German government said, realistically, we should have started our renewable energy transition away from Russian oil and gas 10 to 15 years ago. And if they had, they wouldn't have been in the situation that they found themselves in this year and last year. So with politicians, you sort of end up having to walk that rather weird tightrope that it's all very well thinking long term. But if you have a look at the future of education, for example, in the US, which is something I do a lot on, the politicians who are championing change in the educational system probably will not be around and or in power really in almost any form in 10 years' time. So the biggest problem that a lot of, certainly sort of Western politicians actually have is they say, on the one hand, it is right to plan for the future because the future will come whether we like it or not. But then on the other hand, they have a problem passing the baton of their vision to their successors, who may not actually share the same vision or opinions or beliefs or ideologies that they do. And this then kind of leads us into a trend that we call fragile government. We've seen this basically with the Republicans and the Democrats recently in the US, where the Obama administration would promote science and technology innovation very heavily. And then we saw Trump coming in and kind of reverse a lot of that, he ceased, should we put it in a nice way, quite a lot of funding, which then let China leapfrog them. So when I actually do work in China, they love the fact basically that in the US, a lot of politicians actually end up doing one thing, then the next politician does the opposite of that thing, which then means that in the US's case, you kind of stand still. And then when you have a look at these other authoritarian states, like President Xi, for example, who is now essentially leader for life. Vladimir Putin is essentially leader for life. We've got Singapore, and then we've got the Middle East. The leadership teams basically within those particular countries are able to think long term, but then able to execute over the longer term as well. It's like Xi has a 20-year vision for China, which he's probably going to be at the helm for that 20 years. So this is the sort of unfortunate position we find ourselves in with democracies. In democracies, to use an analogy, we swap the pilot of the plane out every 4 years. And the new pilot, if they want to, can chart a completely new course. Whereas in more authoritarian states, like say China, for example, Xi is the pilot of that plane for the next 20 years, and he sets the direction for 20 years. But then in China, what they do is they swap out the co-pilots. So the plane itself is still on the same trajectory, still on the same journey that Xi wants that plane to be on for 20 years, whether or not anyone else and or the co-pilots like it, which is why ultimately we see quite a lot of, should we say, Eastern countries especially, actually overtaking really the West from a technology supremacy perspective in technologies that vary as far as artificial intelligence and energy, all the way through to quantum computing and materials and so on and so forth.
We hope you're enjoying this latest edition of the Horizontes Leadership Podcasts, a series of conversations designed to inform, instruct, and inspire Latin American business leaders. Entrepreneurs, politicians, business magnates, inventors, authors, subject matter experts, financiers, and cultural icons from across Latin America are among our guests. We hope you find these podcasts as compelling to listen to as we find them interesting to produce. If you wish to also receive our curated reading list of the latest articles, white papers, and interviews we circulate each week, write to us at horizontes@americasme.com. That's HORIZONTES at AMERICASMI.com. And now, back to the Horizontes podcast.
I'm presently in Berlin and have friends who work in the Reichstag who are true technocrats. They've worked their entire careers in the background, the planning process. And one of them actually leads the long-term planning initiative. And there's no question that they missed the boat on the vulnerability with Russia. But there is a lot of planning that goes on around infrastructure, around transition of technologies, around transitions of energy, et cetera, whereby they get buy-in from all the leading parties. And so that plane, although the pilot changes, there's enough autopilot engineering built into it that it continues to some degree, with the democratic advantage that they get to check in and see if, in fact, they're headed in the right direction every 4 years. That's obviously the downside of a dictatorship, is if they set the thing in the wrong direction, then it takes forever to right its course.
Absolutely. And that's the big thing. In a democracy, we are able to change direction, I say relatively quickly if we want to. But say, for example, President Xi in China basically said, right, in 20 years, we want China basically to own the different technology standards like AI, like 5G, so on and so forth. Except the world had actually moved on to a completely different kind of technology platform and he'd got it wrong,
Right.
then you'd be the king of nothing, or the emperor of nothing, basically in China's case. But what I typically see is when we have a look at a lot of these authoritarian states, they do a significant amount of investigative work, and generally they are on point.
Yeah.
There are, if we have a look at China, basically from a military perspective, we've seen the development of hypersonic weapon systems as well as anti-stealth technologies, basically, which make a lot of America's stealth capabilities pretty much useless, up to a sort of 3,000-mile range, which from China's perspective is Guam. And that's so you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head. If the leaders of a particular country kind of get the vision of the future wrong, then they've backed the wrong horse for 20 years. In Dubai's case, for example, they could have backed the wrong horse for 50 years. But if they get it right, and if they can execute correctly, and generally quite a lot of these other countries are able to execute really quite effectively and efficiently, although there are sort of questions, we can always sort of have debates and discussions over that, like Saudi Arabia's, $500 billion smart city, NEOM, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if they can execute correctly, and if they get the vision right, then they are the technology powers of the future. And the one thing, when we have a look at the power of technology over the past sort of really 50 years, there are lots of countries around the world that think a lot of America's dominance has actually come from its technology dominance. If you have a look at the amount of money that has been generated from America's tech scene and tech ecosystem and tech companies, that is not lost on pretty much every other country out there. And so a lot of these countries are trying to build the next tech giants, the next foundational general purpose technologies, like 6G, as we already see spinning up again in China as well as Korea. If they can back the right horses, then the economic and then jobs upside of that is insane. If you take Germany, for example, with Europe, Europe invested 300 billion to spin up new green industries because they understand that, green industries, green energy industries, for example, solar, nuclear, hydro, as well as wind, as well as even things like solar fuels and so on and so forth, lots of things there. They understand basically that the green energy industry is an industry of the future. And so if the governments fund that industry today, when it's just starting to take off, then from Germany's perspective, they know that in the next 5 to 10 years, they will have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people actually employed by the renewable energy sector, which is then also an export business, which then boosts German GDP. So there's lots and lots of different factors to take into account, basically, when we're actually thinking about, what the future could look like, will look like, but then also how to actually kind of get from A to Z.
So let's drill down on some of those factors, because I'm fascinated by the sort of behind the envelope calculations and how you arrive at these conclusions. At our firm, we do much shorter term forecasting. If we're really bold, we'll go sort of 5 to 10 years out in Latin America. And we're basing it mostly on factors such as demographics, technology adoption. But tell me some of the other things that you're looking at. You've talked a lot about technology. What are some of the other factors that you take into account when you're talking to a government client or a private sector client?
So it's a great question. So it's things like investment patterns. So let's take the Betamax versus video, VHS wars. If I put 99% of the investment into Betamax rather than video or VHS, Betamax would have had a chance of winning. Now, it might not have won because there's lots of other factors to play. So firstly, follow the investments. When we have a look at, say, organizations like Visa, and the world of decentralized finance and the future of payments and everything else, where's the money going? Money always indicates a priority and a direction of travel. And whether that's private equity money, hedge fund money, whether it is, GAM money, doesn't really matter. But there's that. Next thing basically we look at is ecosystems. So for example, if I'm an investor and I've just thrown $100 million basically at this new technology, but that new technology is only being developed by one company, then it's likely that technology, unless that company is an expert, a master of execution and all these kinds of things, it's likely that technology is going to just die by the wayside. So this is sort of where, for example, you can take blockchain as being a kind of good indicator. When the blockchain was first, shall we say, brought to light, years and years ago, the first thing that happened is people looked at it and sort of went, it's a bit niche. We don't really see any use cases for it. It's an interesting technology. Don't get us wrong. So the very first stage of any new technology or innovation is typically kind of this disbelief. Yes, it's interesting, but it's never going to catch on. We don't know what we'd use it for. And it's got a ton load of problems. Then someone somewhere kind of says, yeah, but okay, it's an interesting technology, but I'll tell you what, we'll give you a bit of money and we'll give you some resources to develop it. So then someone develops it, and then you kind of get an ecosystem around it. And the ecosystem then starts looking at this particular technology like blockchain and saying, well, transactions per second are a problem, energy usage is a problem, interoperability between chains is a problem, et cetera, et cetera. So the entrepreneurial ecosystem kind of comes together and starts solving a lot of the technology's early problems. And then basically, as the ecosystems grow, all of a sudden we get use cases, because these ecosystems say, well, originally you didn't know what you could use blockchain for, but I've developed this thing called a cryptocurrency, or I've developed a new kind of insurance system, or whatever it happens to be. And all of a sudden you get investors again, kind of that sort of series A, B, C, D, E, as well as companies, sort of more commercially savvy companies going, well, actually, yeah, okay, if you've created this thing called a cryptocurrency and it's got an application over here, okay, maybe we could do something with that, and then the ecosystem grows again, and then the investment comes in, and then the press get interested. And so the press, media, and marketing are very important in the development of new technologies and new innovations, because they draw attention to those things. So all of a sudden you see, for example, the press talking about blockchain or Web3 or the metaverse or, generative artificial intelligence now. And so all of a sudden people then get curious and go, why is everybody talking about this thing called blockchain? And so then that drives the ecosystem more. Investors come in more. And as we iron out all of the different problems with these technologies, like we solve transactions per second, basically when it comes to the blockchain, as we solve the energy problem by moving to, proof of work, for example, as opposed to proof of stake, suddenly the large big companies like, the Microsofts and the Accentures start swooping in and saying, we think that technology is now at a level of development where we could build it into a product. And then they start maturing it, commercializing it, and so on and so forth. And you can see with all of these different innovations and technologies, they always follow this same sort of path where they emerge, people dismiss them, just think it's a crazy, crazy idea that is just frankly interesting, but in the real world, useless. You end up with a couple of people who know what they're talking about, who know about technology, that kind of latch on to these new technologies and innovations, taking a punt, investing on faith in some of these things, the angel investors, and it grows up from there. But I do a lot of work with Silicon Valley, and actually, when you have a look at the DNA, for example, of a unicorn, a company that goes from, say, startup to a multi-billion-dollar valuation or multi-billion-dollar revenues, there are actually about 54 things basically that really need to go right for that company to start up start building a new technology and then end up with a unicorn status. So it really isn't one thing that you've got to get right. I can't just throw a load of money at one particular technology or innovation and it will become an automatic success. It's lots of things. I mean, even down to when we have a look at venture capitalists, you know, when VCs like Accel Partners or Andreessen Horowitz or Sequoia, etc., start investing in a new innovation or technology, one of the things they do is they open their black book and they will say, right, okay, so you've just developed this new thing. If we have a look at things like file sharing, you know, Box and Dropbox and everything else, they'll open their book and say, well, we also invested in Facebook. So Aaron Levie, would you like to be introduced to Mark Zuckerberg? And you can tell Mark basically about your company and your products. And maybe Mark can end up actually helping embed file sharing and all these sorts of things basically within Facebook and Meta. And then the press gets hold of that and says, hey, Facebook is now using Box, you know, or whatever it happens to be. And then the corporates look at that, the CIOs look at that and say, well, if Facebook's using this new technology, then maybe we should look at it as well. So there's lots and lots of things, basically, lots and lots of factors that come into play.
The Horizontes Leadership Forum is brought to you by Americas Market Intelligence, the region's leading consultancy and advisory firm, serving companies operating in Latin America and Caribbean markets for over 3 decades. AMI's vast network of consultants located in every major market in the Americas gather vital market intelligence from privileged sources that our industry practice leaders turn into insightful analysis to help our clients, some of the largest investors in Latin America, make vital business decisions. Before you decide to invest, launch a product, choose a partner, enter a market, or acquire a business, make sure your decision is an informed one. Find us at americasmi.com. That's AMERICASMI.com. And now back to the Horizontes podcast.
What about what about the prospect of conflict of economic shortages, of ethnic rivalry, of weak governments that lead to opportunities taken by rivals, the sort of wargaming that military futurists might look at, but you as somebody who's looking at, and then, on behalf of a country, are they also asking you to take into account those kinds of factors, and how do you do that?
Yeah, so we do wargaming regularly. So in fact, one of the exercises we do is, it's almost that entrepreneur pitch. When the startups basically come into the VCs and say, so I've created a new product, it's a new healthcare product. It can predict heart disease, for example. And did I mention a load of buzzwords? It uses artificial intelligence and machine vision and big data and all this kind of stuff. The VCs kind of look at a lot of these startups and sort of go, okay, check, lots of buzzwords, but we're not really sure what the problem you're trying to solve is, or how you're actually solving it, or how you've got a path to commercializing this and, end up, becoming a big company. So one of the things we do basically is we do wargaming. It's on the one hand, basically, why wouldn't this work? And on the one hand, basically, that's kind of market driven. So, for example, if we have a look at, say, autonomous vehicles, hey, I've got the perfect autonomous vehicle. Well, the reason why no one will actually adopt an autonomous vehicle is because culturally, no one wants to get into a car that drives itself, and where we have to rely on artificial intelligence to brake for us and prevent us going into the central reservation. So you've got sort of culture. So there's lots of ways basically to kind of throw the chaos monkey basically into the mix. But then similarly, we also look at things like disruptive technologies as well. So for example, if you look at 5G and 6G, history would tell us that the future of mobile communications is 5G. And then we have 6G, which is a terahertz or terabit type technology. So 6G will be able to transmit information at the terabit speed, whereas 5G is the gigabit speed. So naturally, from an investment perspective or a government perspective, if you look at the US government just opened up sales of the 7G network spectrum. From a government perspective, they go, well, historically, we've had 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, which means that in the next 20 years, we will naturally have 6G and 7G. So we'll open up the spectrum. We will start building up the ecosystems to support 6G and 7G technology development, and it sounds sensible. However, when we have a look at disruptive technologies, we've got the likes of Starlink and SpaceX with Elon Musk that have been developing space-based low Earth orbit satellite constellations, which can beam essentially internet anywhere on the planet. So with low Earth orbit based satellite communication systems, you can be in the middle of the countryside and get 1.5 gigabits per second. Whereas even on 5G, if you're in the Rust Belt in the US, you'd be lucky to get 30 to 50 megasecond. So what we do is when we start having a look at all these different war games, we're not just throwing in markets, we're throwing in new technologies which could actually usurp the status quo. And then on top of that, we look at things like ethics and morals. When we have a look at brain-machine interfaces, for example, on the one hand, I can already use a brain-machine interface to stream what you're thinking in terms of the language that you are thinking about, but also the images in your head to a TV screen. So we've done that. But from an ethical perspective, if I use that technology on ALS patients who have locked-in syndrome in a hospital, that's an ethical use of brain-machine interface technologies, because we can let that person who's locked in to their own body in a hospital bed communicate their thoughts with their loved ones. So ethically, that's fine. However, if we have brain-machine reading technology going into smart glasses, which we've already seen, or a smartphone, and I think, and all of a sudden that thought is translated into a WhatsApp message and that WhatsApp message is sent, then what other information could companies like Meta and Facebook pull out of your head? And what do we do with the data? What do we do with data regulation?
Not to mention
ethical?
the embarrassment of your teenage sons using such a technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is sort of, while I use brain-machine interfaces as a little bit of an extreme sort of example, it serves as a very good real-world current example, basically, of, okay, so you've got this technology that can literally pull thoughts right out of your head and distribute and publish them to anyone or anything on the planet. But as a government or as a company, do we continue developing those technologies? As a regulator, how do we regulate these technologies? And if we don't regulate these technologies, then these technologies can't be used by these companies like Facebook in the first place. Then they never, ever end up being commercially available.
Right.
So we have lots of fun with chaos monkeys.
Sure,
and there's a lot more chaos monkeys than you might imagine. And we're not just talking about little kiddies.
Right, sure.
They're great chaos monkeys.
Matt, as you know, Horizontes is focused on Latin America. Most of the people who listen, some of them will or may sort of listen to something like this and say, well, that's fine if you live in the United States or Europe. You can, there's a certain return on investment in with long-term planning, but they'll say it's futile to predict anything long-term in Latin America because it's inherently volatile. What do you say to no-sayers like that?
Yeah. So to a degree, basically, they're right. If you have a look at the Latin American political situation, it's tenuous, shall we say. It changes regularly, etc. When you have a look at the Latin American economic situation, it changes regularly as well. I think, recently we had Argentina running at 80% inflation. When we actually have a look at Latin America from a cultural perspective, it's a literal melting point, basically, of cultures. And so this is kind of where with Latin America, it's a real kind of oxymoron. from a futures perspective, because at a really high level, we've got all of these different indicators that say we shouldn't be able to accurately predict the future of what happens in Latin America because of the political volatility, the economic volatility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of right to a degree. However, when you actually have a look at the Latin American entrepreneurial ecosystems, as we saw basically with the future of money and payments and decentralized finance, at the event, they are among some of the most forward-thinking entrepreneurs on the planet. If we have a look at things like real-time payments, for example, India has real-time payments, but Brazil is literally the world leader in real-time payment systems. When we actually have a look at things like cryptocurrencies or central bank digital currencies, you've got Jamaica and the Caribbean, which actually are pioneers of central bank digital currencies, along basically with other countries basically within Latin America. So when it's really interesting that when you actually have a look at that Latin American entrepreneurial spirit, they kind of go, okay, yeah, we do have all these problems and everything else, but on the one hand, every problem is an opportunity. And then on the other hand, if we can't rely on our governments basically to kind of set that 20-year vision and fund us properly and just let us get on with it, then we'll do it ourselves. And it's, when I have a look at Africa, for example, very similar to Africa, Africa basically has a lot of problems basically throughout the continent. But again, when you actually have a look at that entrepreneurial spirit, that human ingenuity, at the grassroots level, it's staggering to see. And it's almost this case of, despite all of these problems, despite of all of these challenges, and despite people saying to people in Latin America and Africa, the reason why you're going to fail is X, Y, and Z, and all the other letters of the alphabet, they succeed because, frankly, they've got a vision. They know how to execute. They know how to get resources basically out of thin air. But in addition to that, they are absolutely tenacious. And it's that tenacity that I see within Africa, basically, and as well as sort of parts of Asia, but especially in Latin America, as we kind of discussed, that means that in a number of different areas and domains, especially in that sort of decentralized finance sort of domain, the future is literally being built in Latin America, despite and in spite of all of these different challenges and these volatilities.
Yeah, I think you've noted something there that's really worth beating down on, and that's if necessity is the mother of all invention. If you look at innovation in Latin America, oftentimes the idea started elsewhere, but that idea was built for a world with far fewer obstacles than Latin America. So when you bring that idea to Latin America, you have to adapt it to the reality. So whether it's a payment system that simply doesn't work because only 12% of the population has a credit card, you have to come up with something else to digitize payments. If you bring in automobiles, guess what? You have to build the chassis higher because the roads have potholes.
Yeah.
They're constantly adapting products. And because it's a middle income country, products that are adapted for Latin America then become quite suitable for 70-80% of the population around the world, which faces similar challenges, but doesn't quite have the advantage of that income level that Latin America has, or the congruency of language, or the proximity to the US, et cetera. All these things that allow Latin America to be first out the gate as an emerging market on a lot of these new technology adaptations. And there's several companies that have gone global that started in Latin America. And by global, I mean emerging market global.
The Horizontes Leadership Forum is brought to you by America's Market Intelligence. Each year, AMI's most senior practice leaders, led by your podcast host, John Price, are invited by over 50 conference, seminar, and private business meeting organizers to provide their insights, predictions, and opinions concerning the most pressing business trends and challenges of the day in the Americas. To learn more about how your next regional planning meeting or conference can be enhanced by a presentation from AMI's leadership team, visit us at americasmi.com. That's AMERICASMI.com. And now, back to the Horizontes podcast.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, if we have a look at super apps, for example, Latin America basically is the number 2 in the world for the development of super apps. Because when we have a look at the banked and unbanked basically in Latin America, it's about 70% of the population. When we have a look at the number of people who lack, should we say, decent internet connectivity or any form of internet connectivity, it's about sort of 250 million plus. And one of the interesting things basically that I've sort of noticed is when you actually have a look at periods of great challenge, so where the world goes through lots of pain and turmoil, like war, like supply chain crunches, like recessions and so on and so forth. Did you know basically that around 95% of all patents are actually produced and actually submitted during times of great turbulence, like the pandemics and the plagues that we've seen of the past? So nothing brings out the need to innovate or the spirit of innovation like a problem. If we were all living in lovely utopian times, how many entrepreneurs would really get off their butts and say, you know what, I'm going to solve this problem that doesn't really exist at the moment. Everyone would go, okay, good luck with that. We wouldn't buy your product anyway because you're not solving a problem. But when you live in a world basically where there are huge barriers to entry, huge numbers of problems, that's when some entrepreneurs actually go, you know what, there is this giant problem. And the problem that we have, say, for example, in Latin America is huge numbers of people are unbanked or underbanked. We don't have reliable internet access, so we need a different way to do payments or finance or money or distribute goods and services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why, I mean, ironically, when you have a look at the problems basically that we see in Latin America, it's actually also it also provides people in Latin America with the greatest opportunity and the greatest reasons to actually do something about those problems and actually innovate new things. But a lot of the problems that they're actually solving aren't unique to the continent. So once you've developed a problem for, say, Latin America, like real-time payments, for example, and so on and so forth, quite a lot of them are actually exportable. And while you might not be able to export them to a country that has already developed the similar technologies, we've kind of got this phrase called shadow innovation. China was very, very good at it. The Americans basically would develop a new product. That new product would, say, for example, be YouTube. And YouTube would take off like crazy. And it would kind of prove the model that people wanted to upload their own video content. So in China, they were just fast followers. They said, well, if there are lots of people in America who want to upload video to this site called YouTube, why don't we create a YouTube clone in China? And so when we actually have a look at the ability for Latin America to actually export a lot of the innovations that the continent's developed, there are plenty of countries around the world, basically, to which those innovations are like, wow, no one in our country has actually done that before. Can we work with you?
Absolutely.
And it gives new market access.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great business model and warrants more investment dollars to build laboratories like that. Yeah. Matt, I want to put you on the spot and pick your brain, make some long-term predictions here.
Yeah.
In Latin America, no Latin American government wants to have to decide between the U.S. versus China. They're enjoying the relationships and the benefits they get from working with both those countries. But how do you see, what do you tell people? I know that you consult with the American government. They often ask you about China. What do you see in the years ahead of the repercussions of the US-China rivalry?
Yeah.
And what does it mean for a region like Latin America that relies on both of these business and strategic partners?
So, yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for putting me on the spot. So, it's fair to say basically that the US and China, as well as Europe, but the US, if we stick to US and China, because that's complex enough, the US and China both actually have their own approaches to what we call soft power. So you've got two kinds of power. You've got soft power, where I do things basically to influence you and your decision making. So, for example, if I loaned you $1 million, then I say, well, there's no conditions basically on me loaning you $1 million. I've done it because I really see value in you, and I think that you are a unique butterfly. However, because I have loaned you $1 million, there's that unspoken language of, because I've loaned you $1 million, when the next United Nations vote comes up on security or militarization, for example, I would certainly like to think that you and I are friends. Read between those lines. So you got, and then there's hard power, which is I'm just going to bomb you if you don't do what I say. Now, hard power basically is the last resort. So the vast majority of countries, like Russia used to be really good at soft power, and then that went south for a variety of reasons we won't get into. But there are a lot of countries that are really good at that soft power. So Latin America kind of finds itself basically in this sort of middle ground, basically, where on the one hand, they're being courted very strongly by the Chinese government, the CCP, but they're also being slightly less strongly courted by the Americans. And America and China kind of have two different approaches basically to how they court the governments of other countries. So in China, basically, so the Chinese government will typically go to a sovereign government and say, look, we want to embrace a spirit of peace. We want economic cooperation, and we want you to win, and we want us to win, even though it's actually about the motherland. So about a month and a half ago, I met the vice minister for the Ministry of Science and Technology of China, basically in Hong Kong. Everything in China is about the motherland. When you really boil it down, everything is about how does China become bigger, better, bolder, brighter, et cetera, et cetera. Don't get me wrong. It's not about all in it together. It's motherland, a little bit like Trump with MAGA. So what you have basically with the Chinese government is they'll come in and say, look, we want to work with you in a spirit of true friendship and cooperation. And that sounds great. The American government, on the other hand, will typically go into a country basically and kind of scold them and say, we're going to tell you off for your human rights records and your LGBT records and everything else. So on the one hand, basically quite a lot of governments that I talk to actually don't like that. We saw that with Qatar, for example. The Qataris basically were sort of trying to move their society forward, but everybody was focused on everything that they'd done wrong, rightly or wrongly, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into debates about that because we'll be here for donkey's years and we'll probably all end up fighting anyway. And I'll bring in my big AI robot, and it's an awesome machine. So you've kind of got differences in approaches. Now, one of the easiest ways to influence the strategic direction and thinking of a country, as well as the government of that country, is investment. Pounds, shillings, and pence basically actually talk. So with China, the Chinese government in 2010 started something called the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a $1 to $2 trillion infrastructure building program that links all of the Chinese supply chains and logistics chains basically to different countries. So there's that, and that's a part of a soft power play, which is, again, a big conversation in itself, because I've loaned you $3 billion to build a new port. I would certainly like to think that at the next United Nations vote, we are friends, and I won't tell you to vote with me, but, I did just loan you $3 billion. So on the one hand, basically the Latin American governments have to balance the reality of, who are my largest trading partners? Where am I going to get the most money from? because money builds industries, jobs, and that keeps politicians in power. If the people are really happy, they keep the politicians in. If the people are all rebelling because they hate something, because the economy's gone to rubbish, then they're going to start rioting and trying to kick out the governments. And we've seen that a lot, basically, really around the world, not just Latin America. So at a very high level, Latin American governments look at it and go, which country or countries will I benefit from the most economically? So that's one conversation. However, when you have a look at things like the Belt and Road Initiative, China basically has been trying to increasingly dominate and own and create the technology standards that the world uses. So, for example, we increasingly have the Chinese version of 5G technology and the European version of 5G technology. We increasingly have Chinese artificial intelligence and everyone else's artificial intelligence from a technology standards perspective. Those are the two key words there. Even when we have a look at things like ultra high voltage energy grids, you've got the Chinese energy grid standard and everybody else's energy grid standard. So as China has been developing the Belt and Road Initiative, in 30 countries' cases, they've also written in memorandums of understanding that because I've loaned you $3 billion for this port, I would very much appreciate it if you adopt our 5G or internet standards. So now what we're seeing is we're starting to see this bifurcation of technology standards where, say, from a 5G perspective, my country uses Chinese 5G, not, Finnish, European 5G. So that, again, exerts particular influence and sways government decision making.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in all defense of the Chinese, they're running a playbook that the Europeans ran at one point, the Americans ran at one point. Foreign aid, for lack of a better term, whether it's bilateral loans or true aid, at the end of the day is the true political motive is to benefit your own industries. China had to stop building highways and high rises because they overbuilt, and they built a huge construction and engineering sector. And those people needed jobs. And so the Belt and Road was really a way to keep those companies busy, albeit in foreign lands. And the same goes for, clamping down on its tech sector at home in order to limit the political power of those companies. Those companies, they recognize, do need to thrive for China to thrive. So let them thrive elsewhere.
Well, you've got that. But then the interesting thing is, a lot of people actually look at the Chinese crackdown on its big technology giants because, when you have a look at Jack Ma, for example, he was getting rich enough, powerful enough, and well-known enough and popular enough that he could have been a threat to the CCP, in one way or another. And so they started clamping down basically on a lot of the internet giant, the technology giants in China. But China has also got, but when we talk about soft power, they've also got something called the Little Giants program. Now, the Little Giants program is where the Chinese government are funding the growth and development of mid-sized businesses in strategic sectors like robotics and so on and so forth. They don't want these companies to become, an Alibaba. They want these companies to become a $50 million revenue company, or a whatever it happens to be, a sort of mid-sized company. But these little giants are designed to burrow into the supply chains. So you end up being heavily reliant on China and Chinese companies for different niche products, whether you know it or not. And then another sort of tool of choice that we're actually seeing China deploy, along with the BRICS. So, Brazil is obviously part of that as well, India, et cetera, is the attempt to, I'd say usurp, but that's a very sort of Western view. It's sort of, how dare you usurp, is the attempt to change the global reserve currency. So, we've seen Saudi Arabia, for example, now develop the Petro Yuan, so that people can now buy oil in yuan as opposed to US dollars. And of course, when we sort of bring it back to economics, if I, as a Latin American country, am now more reliant on the yuan or the ruble or the whatever it happens to be than the US dollar, then for purchases and trades and transactions and everything else, then inevitably I'm going to, my primary relationship or my leaning is going to be towards, say, China or the BRICS. So when we actually have a look at the BRICS, with India, for example, as well, they're now trying to develop a purpose-built digital currency. It's not quite a cryptocurrency, but they are increasingly looking at BRICS, the BRICS countries being able to trade with one another in currencies that are not the US dollar, which then starts undermining the US and the current financial system as it is. But this isn't a new play, as you sort of mentioned, with Europe and the technology playbooks. These aren't new plays. When we were at the height of the French Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, and when those empires started declining and we saw the rise of the American Empire, we saw a change in the global reserve currencies. We also saw changes in militarization, cultures, and all sorts of different things. So Ray Dalio basically sort of puts quite a good video together on this if people are interested. When we change from when the world changes from having one superpower to having two superpowers, we move from a sort of US centric world to a bipolar and a multipolar world eventually, basically with India. Inevitably, from in this case, a Latin American government perspective, suddenly that changes the relationships that I build. It changes my strategic priorities and so on and so forth. And which countries are my friends, which countries I align with, comes down to things like cultural values. Democracies are more likely to team together with democracies, and there are currently 23 full democracies. So we all get together. But authoritarian states are also more likely to clump together with authoritarian states, which is why we see, Russia, China, Iran, and so on and so forth, often being used in the same sentences. So we're in this really strange period of time where we are transitioning from America the Great, shall we say, in terms of the power of America and the vision that is America and everything else, to a bipolar world, which is really something that no one living today has actually ever been through or seen before. But when you have a look at China, China is doing relatively well from the playbook that it has created. China is fascinating as a political animal, as a cultural animal, and everything else. And it's fascinating to see things on the ground in China. If people have the opportunity, I say, go and have a look at things on the ground in China. It's interesting to talk to the ministers in China, because, as I sort of travel around the world, I speak with probably about 50 to 60 governments, and I speak with the vast majority of multinationals, irrespective of where they're sort of based, whether it's Samsung in Korea, Huawei basically in Shanghai and Shenzhen, or whether it's Disney and gang basically in Orlando. As I sort of travel the world, it's really interesting to see the interplay of different cultures and start getting a bit more of a view on how the real world works at a macro level. It's enough to make your head spin.
Sure. Matt, this conversation, I'm sure, is going to spark more interest in you and your writings.
Yeah.
Where can people find out more about you, things that you've published, talks that you've given? Have you got a website you can share with us?
Yeah, so I have all the usuals. So the main website is 311institute.com, but I also run a futurist news blog, which is updated pretty much every day, which is fanaticalfuturist.com. But then I've also got a YouTube channel, which is Fanatical Futurist. And I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Twitter, if anyone uses that any longer. But if you want to download, if you want to sort of see my keynotes, my work, download my books for free, get inside my head, then the best site to go to is 311institute.com. And then you've got lots of free education there, lots of free information on the future of different technologies and trends and God knows what. So
Terrific. No, that's wonderful. Matt, we've run out of time. There was a lot of other things we wanted to discuss, and perhaps we can do a second version in the near future. But thank you for sharing it with us, some of your ideas, both how you do your work, how clients use it, and some of those fanatical futurist forecasts. So really appreciate it. Always
thank
nice
you
to
as
chat.
well.
And I wish you well with all your upcoming travels. Thank you for joining us for another Horizontes podcast, where we discuss key topics and challenges facing Latin American business leaders, featuring expert guests from a variety of fields and backgrounds. Horizontes is brought to you by America's Market Intelligence, the leading Latin American market intelligence consultancy. We gather the research, conduct the analysis, and form the recommendations in the bespoke fashion that companies require to make wise business decisions in Latin American and Caribbean markets. You can find Horizontes on all major podcast directories like Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and more. Or you can visit our website, americasmi.com, and look for Horizontes under the Thought Leadership menu.